This is Professor Simon's history classroom, and Alexander the Great is filling in for Professor Simon again. Apparently, he is out, so I am kind of taking his place today. Why do I have blood on my face? Well, I had to come from a battle, the Battle of Gaugamela. I was kind of defeating this king named Darius III, and he told me to come and see you. So here I am. So, anyway, this week, what you're doing for lectures, you are going to have lectures on the Greco Persian Wars, continuing the history of the Greeks. That is a very important period. It's when the Greek city states defeat the Achaemenid Empire. So that is a great period. Of course, I later finished them off. The Persians is something I am kind of known for, but that'll be in the next century, the 4th century BC. So that's one of the main things he'll talk about. And then he'll also get into classical Greece, by the way. Talk about all the Olympics at the time. They also have, of course, famous philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And he also get into all the famous plays like Oedipus Rex, which was well known at the time. And then he'll even talk about the Greek mythologies, all the different gods that the Greeks believed in, like Zeus, my father, of course, and stuff like that. So, anyway, I see the United States. What is wrong with that country? I don't understand. You have a president that doesn't know who he is and where he is at. In fact, Alexander has been thinking, I'm kind of been conquering Persia. I think my next conquest is going to be the United States of America. I am going to conquer everybody in the world. Anyway, I'm just kidding. So this week, the ancient Greeks, we will continue, of course. So I will see you later. Alexander the Great, I am.
Of course, the Greco-Persian Wars, like I said, it occurred over like a period of like 50 years. Kind of give you the dates for it right here, but it mostly pitted in the early 5th century BC between what is the Achaemenid Empire, is what they called it. Usually called the First Persian Empire because there was more than one. I think it was like at least three major Persian empires that existed in around Iran and against the Greek city states, of course, that fought it. You can see 499 to 449 BC is the years of when the actual Greco Persian Wars took place. It is called different names. Of course, some people just call it the Persian Wars for short as well. And I'll get to Herodotus later. He's, of course, one of the major historians that writes about the wars. Now, so I did want to kind of share with you right there. So, yeah, that's the actual name of the actual Persian Empire, the first Persian Empire, Achaemenid Empire, which is actually the dynasty that ruled over it for, I think, something like 200 something years that it was around. But you can see the rise of the Persian Empire. It occurs in the Near East, in what we call ancient Iran. I'll kind of get to it in a second right here. Here's kind of a map showing you, of course, the Persian Empire. Of course, considered a massive empire, by the way, one of the largest in history. The Achaemenid Empire, it's kind of like at one point they believe it was over 2 million square miles, stretching from close to where India is. The Hindu Kush is kind of like the eastern border of it. You can see it stretched into Iran, which is where it started. And then, of course, it included part of Iraq, Turkey, Egypt. And then at one point, it did expand into Greece at one point. This empire was huge. I think they say at one point they controlled something like 30 to 40% of the known population of the world. I think their population may have been possibly 50 to 60 million people. So very large in size. So it's like one of the largest empires in history so far. In fact, it was one of the first that controlled 3 continents believe it or not, most of southwestern Asia, part of North Africa, and part of Europe with Greece as well. Of course, that was the founder. Of course, Cyrus the Great. We'll talk a little bit about him. We've kind of mentioned about Cyrus the Great before. He's also known as King Cyrus II. He was, of course, a famous monarch of ancient Iran that lived in the 6th century BC. So he founded the empire close to about 559 BC, and he's the one that actually, I guess, the one that kind of calls it Achaemenid dynasty, which was actually named after a great-great-grandfather of his named Achaemenes, who may have been one of the first kings of Persia. And this dynasty of kings, which had like 17 kings at one point in it, reigned down to about 330 BC before it was actually conquered by Alexander the Great, which we'll, of course, talk about that later. It had different capitals, by the way, kind of listed right here, but Pasargadae was one of the, Pasargadae was one of the actual original capitals that was founded by Cyrus the Great, like in southern Iran today. And then there was a later capital added, which is called Persepolis. That's the one that people know more about, I think, today more than anything, because the ruins of it are in southern Iran. But that particular capital was founded later by Darius the Great, who was kind of like a cousin of Cyrus the Great overall. Oh, by the way, going back to that map I was showing you earlier, which is right here, you look here, they think that in ancient Iran a long time ago, which, by the way, Iran supposedly means in Persian, land of the Aryans. It's believed that the ancient Iranians were related back to Indo-Aryan peoples that came out of like where the Caucasus Mountains are between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. They kind of came down there and settled in Iran something like 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. And so usually the peoples that settle in Iran are called Indo-Iranians. I think I've talked about that before because the ones in India are called Indo-Aryans, kind of, differentiate between those two different peoples. But those are the peoples that will settle there and the ones that eventually end up, creating this actual state of Persia. And by the way, Persia itself, the empire, was made up of multiple states. They believe that what happened was the Persian Empire formed out of the kingdom of Persia, which Cyrus originally ruled, which I think Susa was one of the early cities, and then Pasargadae was another city that, of course, that he built, which became its capital. And then what happened was they think Cyrus conquered the kingdom of Media, which is in northern Iran. They're called the so-called Medes. And they had a city and capital called Ecbatana. And so those two states were merged together, and that's what formed the basis of the early first Persian Empire, or so-called Achaemenid Empire as well. They did absorb other states too. I'll mention the Scythians were also absorbed into this empire, which Scythians were up in the close to where Armenia is in that map, kind of between the Caspian and the Black Sea, where they lived, called Scythia, which was a kingdom at one point in Iran, ancient Iran. And then Bactria, the Bactrians, was a kingdom that was kind of in the northeastern part of Iran, close to the Caspian Sea, and it was absorbed also into the empire as well. But you can see most of the empire itself. I think I've got another map here I can kind of share with you right here. You can see all the areas that were conquered that eventually formed into this empire. So those areas that are kind of in that pinkish color, I guess, orange pink color right there. Those areas that Cyrus the Great first conquered, which included Media, of course, they began pushing it eastward towards the Indus River. And then, of course, they pushed, you can see, westward towards Turkey. And eventually, Cyrus the Great also conquers Lydia, the kingdom of Lydia, in 547 BC. And then he also conquered, you can see as well, the Babylonian Empire. You know, a member of Nebuchadnezzar, it fell to the Persians in 539 BC. And you can see all the area where Israel is in Syria, all that was also absorbed into it as well. So the bulk of the empire was conquered by Cyrus the Great, and then other relatives came later. There was Cambyses, he was a son of Cyrus the Great, conquered also Egypt, you can see, 525 BC as well. So that's kind of showing you like some of the different areas that were conquered over time with this empire. But yeah, it's a huge empire, the largest in history so far, of course, at that point. There, of course, is the tomb of Cyrus the Great you're looking at right there, which was at the ruins now of Pasargadae, of course, I talked about, which was the original capital, of course, in southern Iran now. They also had Darius the Great. We'll talk more about him in the Persian Wars as well. He kept expanding the empire. They think by his reign, the empire had expanded all the way into get close to Greece. They started pushing into Greece a little bit at that point. Libya, Afghanistan, Pakistan, all the way to the Indus River. They expanded at one point. So under him and his son Xerxes the Great, is really the peak size of the Persian Empire between the 6th and the 5th centuries. Some other things about Darius that are very famous you may have heard about. Darius is the one that constructed the Royal Road. I don't know if you know much about the Royal Road, but the Royal Road was a famous highway system of the Persians that was constructed from what is southern Iran, and it went through Iraq into all the way to Turkey, western Turkey. So you can see where it started in Susa and went up through close to where Babylon is. And then you can see it pushed westward to Sardis, which is one of the main capitals that was in the western part of Turkey under the empire. And this highway system they built of the Persians was almost 1,700 miles in length. I think the actual length I've looked up is 1,677 miles long. So it's something around that length, basically. And it was important later, not just connecting, throughout the whole Persian Empire and, trade within its empire, but it obviously made it easier for like the Persian army to march east to west across the empire. It's also important too, because if you know about the Royal Road, it was kind of considered part of the leg of the Silk Road later, like the end of it, I guess, as it goes from east to west towards Constantinople. That'll be like the end leg of it, of course, which will be important. Herodotus, I think, was one of the first to write about it in his histories of Herodotus. He talks about how it took around a week or so for riders, like on horseback, to go from say that they had to go from Turkey to, I guess, Iran. It would take something like 7 to 9 days. I think is usually what it was. If you had to walk on foot, though, it took about 3 months to go from east to west or vice versa. So that's pretty amazing about that. I think that's an image kind of showing you like part of the road. I think parts of the road still exist in like Iran and other areas of the world. But like I said, it was part of the leg of the Silk Road, at one point. Of course, the other thing that he did that's very famous, I was talking about, is he built Persepolis, which, of course, if you know about this, became the capital of the Persian Empire. They think it was built sometime close between 518 and 515 BC, roughly. So sometime at the end of the 6th century is when the Persians began constructing it under Darius the Great. and the ruins of it are in southern Iran, close to a city called Shiraz. And I think I want to say 30, 40 miles from it. That's where it is. And it's, if you know about it, it's famous later for Alexander the Great conquered Persia in the late 4th century, and he destroyed the city and burned it down. And so that's why today the city is nothing but ruins now because of what happened with the Greek conqueror Alexander the Great. A few other things about Darius I did want to mention also as well. Darius was the one that divided the Persian Empire into 20 provinces, which are called a satrapy, I think is what they call the actual province of the Persian Empire. And each of these provinces were ruled by a viceroy or viceroyal governor who acted for the king, usually, put in power by the king. But a lot of times they would use local officials, sometimes that were, pro-Persian, and they were called a satrap, basically. And so the satraps were something that the Persians invented, and in other states, like I know Alexander the Great borrowed it, and other states that came later also used that as well. Darius also standardized their coinage system as well, which they think a lot of their monetary ideas were influenced by the kingdom of Lydia in Turkey, which was one of the first to start using like gold coins and things like that. And then I think their official languages were Aramaic and Old Persian is mostly what they used under his reign. Now they have a later monarch I'll get to later, which is Xerxes the Great. Xerxes is probably considered the peak ruler, really, of the Persian Empire. It's when it was at its largest size. And Xerxes, is going to be the one that's going to eventually push the empire into parts of Europe and try to conquer Greece, which he eventually failed, of course, in the so-called Greco-Persian Wars. One more thing I did want to mention about Persia before I move on. They had a different religion compared to what the Greeks had. The Greeks had, Zeus and all those different gods I'll kind of talk about later. You can kind of see here's kind of a map too showing you his empire, Xerxes later, of course. But they had this religion called Zoroastrianism that spread throughout that region that the Persians controlled in the Near East. And Zoroastrianism was like a Persian religion. It was like their main religion. They had other religions too, like Judaism and Egyptian religions and so on, probably religions in Babylon, etc. But this was a main religion of Persia that was around for a long time. It was used by the Parthian Empire, the Sassanid Empire as well, and it had different names. Some people called it Mazda Yazna because of the god Ahura Mazda that was real popular. And it was a type of religion that was founded by this Iranian prophet whose name was Zoroaster. I think I've got an image of Zoroaster right here. And he lived about, there's kind of debate about when he lived. He either lived somewhere between 600 to about 1000 BC. And he adopted this god named Ahura Mazda. Ahura Mazda was some type of Persian god that was associated with creation. And he was also seen as the god of wisdom, like all knowledge. In fact, his name in Persian supposedly means wise lord. And so he began to adopt this god. They think they had other gods too, but they eventually got rid of them over time, and they went to one god. I think I've got a map showing you, but at one point, Zoroastrianism was pretty widespread throughout the world. So it's considered one of the first widespread religions to spread all over the world. So I think it spread at one point towards India, where some people still practice it, by the way. You can see base mostly centralized in Iran and Afghanistan, but you can see it pushed into like Iraq, Turkey, and even pushed as far west as like Egypt and maybe into Greece at one point as well. You'll see a lot of images of Ahura Mazda. He was a man, like a winged type man, uh, almost like a solar symbol, I guess, in a sense. You're looking at right there. But yeah, it was considered a creator god, like the God that created everything and so on, but believed to be a god of all knowledge in general. And the one thing about Ahura Mazda, if you study about the religion, it was one of the first religions that really had concepts of things like the idea of Satan, the idea that there were good and evil, angels and demons. Those are ideas that they kind of pushed forth that influenced other religions like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, etc. So yeah, it was a religion that influenced a lot of people theological wise, etc. But yeah, it's like around for several centuries. But over time, what happened was when Islam spread to the Middle East or Near East, they eventually stamped it out. So very few people practice it anymore. I want to say 100 to 200,000 is how many people practice it now throughout the world. I think it's mostly in Iran, and I want to say India. It's kind of popular. Let me get to the main thing, of course, today, which is the Greco-Persian Wars, of course, which I told you break out at the beginning of the 5th century BC. Kind of go to this slide right here, but you can see the main reason why the Persian Empire broke out was because of this event that happened between 499 to 494 BC, which was the so-called Ionian Revolt. That happened. What was the Ionian Revolt? It was this conflict between the Persian Empire and Greek city-states that were in Western Turkey, an area that's called Ionia. And that area did not want to be under Persian rule. So here, kind of slide right there about that. But states like Miletus and a few others all revolted because they didn't really want to pay taxes to the Persians, didn't want to be under Persian rule. I think it was a case where they even had to serve in Persian armies, like give allegiance to Persians. The Persians even tried to put in tyrants to rule over their states that were all pro-Persian. And so this was kind of an unpopular thing. And so 499, they revolted against the Persians. Here's kind of some other images right here, but they think it's happened under Darius the Great. Of course, when the revolt breaks out, and Darius is going to have to come in and put it down, like sack basically cities like Miletus that revolt against the Persians. And there was a case, here's kind of a map showing you right here, but what happened was the Greeks, I think it was mostly Athens was the main one behind it. And there's another state called Eretria, which was on the island of Euboea. They sent forces to help the Ionians in Western Turkey. And they marched over land and they attacked the city of Sardis, which Sardis was one of their satrapal capitals that was in Turkey at the time. I don't think they were to take the city, but they did sack and burn it. And so that's kind of what starts the war at that point afterwards, because Darius the Great's angry about this. He's angry because of the fact that city-states like Athens are supporting this rebellion against the Persian Empire. Darius eventually succeeds. He actually puts down the revolt. And I think Miletus was sacked at one point after that. And so that's initially what starts the war at this point, with Darius sending forces to attack Greece. Now, by the way, the actual main historian that writes about the Greco-Persian Wars, of course, is Herodotus. And of course, we know up here in this image right here, you can see Herodotus wrote a series of books which chronicleize Greek history at the time. It's sometimes called either the Histories of Herodotus, or sometimes they do call it the History of the Persian Wars, because that's mostly what the wars are about. He also included a history of Egypt, if you know about it, because Egypt was, at the time controlled by Persia, which they did for something like 200 years at one point. His is the oldest source, by the way. So you have to pretty much rely on Herodotus for information about all the battles and conflicts that took place between Greece and Persia. He is prone to exaggeration, which a lot of ancient historians are. I think he said when Xerxes invaded around 480 BC, he said they had 2 million troops or more. So kind of an exaggeration. But by the quotes of famous men that were in like the I guess in the war were gotten from him overall. Here's kind of a map here. You can see the actual map of the Persian invasions, which there's two main invasions they'll have. One in 490, which started by King Darius the Great, and then his son Xerxes the Great has a second invasion, 480 BC. But you can see that the first invasion of Darius, that orange line, he sends a fleet with of course troops to attack Athens and Greece right there. And that's what begins pretty much the Greco-Persian Wars in mainland Greece. That leads, of course, to one of the first battles, really, of the whole war in the Greek mainland, of course, which is the Battle of Marathon, which happened, by the way, in September of 490 BC. It's considered really not just the first major battle in the actual Persian Wars, but they think in European history. And sometimes they talk about the Trojan War and all that, but they're not sure if that was real or not. But it is considered one of the first major battles in European history. And yeah, it's a turning point in the war because I'll get to it later. Darius is not successful, of course, in this conflict. The actual force is not led by Darius. It's led by this general named Datis. Yeah, Datis was a Persian general. And it also included a Greek tyrant we've talked about named Hippias. He actually had been kicked out of Athens and wanted to take back power. And so they think what was going to happen was Darius was going to conquer Athens and put him as a tyrant to basically rule over it. I guess he was going to try to take over Greece, was his main goal. Here's where they fought. They fought on what is called the Plain of Marathon, which is, by the way, in the Attica Peninsula, it's about 26 miles near Athens. And anyway, here's kind of an image, of course, of the Battle of Marathon on the right. There was actually about 10 generals of the Athenians that were actually there at the battle. The main general, though, that led the forces into battle was a general named Miltiades. If you know about the Greeks, a general was called a strategos, is what they called it. And Miltiades, supposedly in this battle, was one of the first to use what they call a double envelopment, where they attacked the Persians from multiple sides on their left and their right flank. And the Greeks were heavily outnumbered. The Greeks had something like 10,000 hoplites, and the Persians had 30,000 troops. But if you look at this map here of the battlefield, the Persians were just coming off their ships. And so the Greeks were able to attack them at the best time before they could organize all their forces. And I don't think that was the majority of their forces. I think they had more force than that, including cavalry. And so when the Persian force came up, they concentrated more of their forces on the left and the right. According to Herodotus, the Persian force was routed in the battle. It was just a lopsided battle where the Persians suffered close to 6,400 casualties, and the Greeks, according to Herodotus, 192, if you believe those numbers. But evidently, it was a lopsided battle, and they actually chased the Persians back onto their ships, and they were forced to flee at that point. I think I've got another image of the battlefield, which is right there, but I don't think they got all their forces out to really fight in the battle. Of course, there's a famous incident that happened afterwards you may have heard about. It's a so-called marathon run of Phidippides that happened right afterwards. And Phidippides was some kind of Greek herald that was sent supposedly to Sparta to try to get aid for the Athenians in the battle, but they didn't send forces till later, until the battle was over. And so what happened, supposedly after the Greeks won Marathon, he ran all the way to Athens, like 26 miles. And the story is mentioned by different writers. It's actually mentioned by Herodotus, who calls him Phidippides. And then there's another writer, he's a Roman writer writing about 2nd century CE, named Lucian. Lucian calls him Philippides. So he does have different names that he's called. But supposedly what Lucian says is that he got there and told them that they had won the battle. He supposedly said something like Nikamen, which means in Greek, we won, victory, and he dropped dead. Now, if you know about it later, when they have the Olympic Games, like the modern games in 1896, they invented the so-called marathon run to honor the marathon run of Phidippides from Marathon to what is Athens, 26.2 miles or 42 kilometers. And so that's something that is something that started at that point. So the marathon run was something that wasn't really invented until modern times, but supposedly associated with this battle, famously in history. Some people think it's not even real, like mythological more than anything, but it's a very famous story, of course, told by Herodotus and the Roman writer Lucian. Now, they do have a second invasion. Darius gave up and went home back to Persia. He was assassinated, and his son took over, which is King Xerxes. Xerxes is involved in a massive invasion of Greece, which takes place between 480 to 479 BC, which there's kind of a debate about how large of an army this Persian force was. Some people think it was 250,000 to about 300,000 in size. And Herodotus claimed it was like 2 million or more. I think 2.3 million may have been, I thought, what he said, or something like that. Some huge size, which is totally ridiculous. But they do think it was one of the largest armies ever amassed in history. And the one thing that's different about Xerxes, if you know about it, he brought his navy over, but he took most of his force by land through northern Greece. So he invaded through northern Greece. And I got some maps to kind of share right there. There's Xerxes, of course, in that image. But look at this map right here. He actually took his force and they actually marched right below where the Sea of Mara Mara is, which is kind of like right below the Black Sea. And they crossed an area that's called the Dardanelles Strait, which a long time ago the Greeks used to call it the Hellespont. And there's a story where Herodotus said that Xerxes actually built a bridge across the Dardanelles Strait, maybe close to a mile in length, eventually using pontoon bridges, which was pretty amazing at the time. And he claimed that the first bridge collapsed, and he actually had all the men killed that failed to build it the first time, and he got men out, and they whipped the water, tried to get the water to cooperate, and then he built the second bridge, and then they marched across. So yeah, you come down, you see through Thrace, Macedonia, those areas will be invaded by Xerxes' forces. Because of that invasion, what ends up happening is the Greeks eventually form an alliance together. So you get this deal where the Greek city-states band together to form a military league, kind of like a Greek league or Hellenic league. And they realize that if they don't band together, put up forces to fight the Persians, they're going to get conquered by them. So I'll kind of talk about what the Greeks did at that point. Their strategy was to basically send forces into northern Greece, and they tried to block two areas, the Thermopylae Pass and the Artemisium Strait. Both those were areas on the northern part of Greece that they tried to block to slow down the Persian invasion so that they could send reinforcements up to try to meet the onslaught of the Persians. I think they also they used that time to evacuate the southern areas because they knew that the Persians were going to come down and sack a lot of cities. So they did that also as well. I think I've got some other maps right here, but you can see the map. That's where they cross right there, by the way. So the Hellespont would be right below the Sea of Marmara. It actually crosses over from Turkey to what is the Gallipoli Peninsula. And so from there, they marched up into that western part of Turkey. You see below the Black Sea, and then into Thrace in northern Greece from there. Here's another map to show you, of course. So Thermopylae in that circle right there was one area where the Greeks sent forces to block the Persians. And if you look up there on the top of the island of Euboea, they also sent naval forces to where Artemisium is, so-called Strait of Artemisium, to try to block the Persian Navy from going down through there, which was supplying Xerxes' forces. They failed at that. They also kind of failed at Thermopylae too, as well, because the Persians break through, but they do slow it down for a few days. Now, of course, the most famous thing you know about, of course, that second invasion is the Battle of Thermopylae. And the Greeks sent a small force, maybe about 7,000 men, led by that famous king there you're looking at, King Leonidas of Sparta, who was famous Spartan king, of course, well known to the Battle of Thermopylae. That's a famous painting, by the way, by Jacques-Louis David. It was done, I think, in the late 18th century. Leonidas at Thermopylae. So he led about 7,000 troops, which included mostly city-states from Thebes and Thespia. Yeah, Thespia was the other state that was involved. And then he had about 300 Spartan soldiers, crack troops that were under him as well. So they had like 7,000 men hold the pass against probably 300,000 Persians that were going to, break through at that point. So they were vastly outnumbered, by the way, at the Battle of Thermopylae. That's the actual battle site, by the way, of Thermopylae today. If you know about Thermopylae, originally it was a narrow battlefield because you had the sea to the east, of course, and then the mountains to the west that were there. And Thermopylae is, by the way, the name, if you wonder about it, it's called Thermopylae because there's some nearby hot springs that are there. And so the term Thermopylae actually means hot gates, is what the translation of it. So people would bathe in those springs that you're looking at. But the battle itself took place in August of 480 BC, is when they actually fight. Here's kind of another aerial view of the actual battlefield. So at one point, the water came up where that line is. You can see shoreline in 480 BC. And then you can see how narrow it was that the troops had to go through. Got mountains to the west of it. And so it was a very narrow pass where the road went through, of course, between that, northern Greece, and into what they call Boeotia, which is below. Here's kind of another image, of course, of the Battle of Thermopylae. It was a 3-day battle. And part of why it was 3 days was because the battle was, like I said, a very narrow pass. The Persians couldn't get their whole force in there. And so the Greeks had superior numbers because of this. And so, like I think in 2 days or so, the Persians suffered something like 20,000 casualties trying to take the pass, according to Herodotus. I think they end up, I want to say the Greeks lose 4,000 men. The Persians lost like 20,000, trying to take the pass. And part of why the Persians were able to eventually break through, there was a Greek trader that gave away information about a pass that went around Thermopylae. His name was Ephialtes. You may have heard of him which, by the way, Ephialtes in Greek today means nightmare, believe it or not. He wasn't Spartan. I think it was a case where some movies have claimed he was a Spartan. He actually wasn't. He was actually from a nearby city state that was in that area, and he did it for money. Basically, gave them information for money, and so the Persians were able to outflank Leonidas's forces, and so at that point, what happened? Leonidas had to basically uh, retreat with some of his forces, and he left a rear guard with himself to try to slow him down. And so the rest of the men, like 1,500, fought to the death, of course, on the third day. So that's the famous Battle of Thermopylae, of course, with that. And yeah, there's a statue there at the site now, which was later put in modern times, which you see on the left. I thought I have another image of it, which is right there. And supposedly in Greek, it says something like, come and take them or come and get them, which supposedly was a quote that Leonidas told the Persians when they asked them to surrender on the first day, which they refused. And so Leonidas, of course, became later a very famous hero in, of course, the Greco-Persian Wars. A lot of poems were later, of course, written about him as well. But yeah, the Persians seized the pass. I think they were so mad about Leonidas' forces trying to slow them down that they found his body and they cut his head off and they put it on a pike, if you know about that. But they do think that the battle might have demoralized the Persian forces. Some claim it was kind of like a Pyrrhic victory for Xerxes' forces, but they did eventually come down the pass. So I've got a map showing you here right there. But after Thermopylae, you can see Xerxes' forces would actually attack down into Boeotia, which they sacked the city-state of Thebes. Then they attacked Attica, and they also sacked Athens as well. So behind me, you know, the Acropolis, at least the old Parthenon Temple Athena, was actually burned by Xerxes' forces, but most of the city-states like Athens had actually been evacuated at that point to what is the island of Salamis. That's another thing I wanted to talk about too. That's also famous. I did want to get into, which is what happens afterwards. They have, of course, the famous Battle of Salamis, which really, in the end, ends up being the most famous battle, really, of the actual Greco-Persian Wars, because it's considered the one that's the turning point of the wars. And what happened was, like I said, the Greeks had evacuated that area, like Attica, and I think that's part of Boeotia. They evacuated people towards what is the Isle of Salamis, which is in the Saronic Gulf. It's kind of between what would be Attica and the Peloponnese Peninsula. And the Greek Navy had also sailed down there too, to where that is. And this man here in that image right there, they were talking about in that short video at the beginning, Themistocles would end up being the hero of the Battle of Salamis, which, you know, was a naval battle. And Themistocles was an Athenian politician, but he was also a pretty good general that had a lot of military experience that went back to the Battle of Marathon. And Themistocles had talked the Athenians a few years before into building something like 200 triremes, which would be very, very vital in the Battle of Salamis, because the trireme would end up being the thing that really changes the whole war in the end. And so that's really what it was. You know, Athenian naval power played a major role in the Battle of Salamis because I think about, I want to say 2/3, I want to say 60-70% of the actual Greek Navy at Salamis was actually Athenian warships that were there. Here, by the way, is an example, of course, you know, the so-called triremes we talked about before. They're very famous. there's kind of a replica that they built. Well, the Greek Navy has this ship called the Olympias, you may have heard of. And it's a trireme that was reconstructed back then, like in the 1980s. And the average trireme weighed about probably 40 tons, 40-ton ship, powered by oars with sails. Average trireme was about 120 feet in length. Had about 170 oarsmen, maybe about 200 men total on a ship. And the average speed of a trireme was about 9 knots, which, if you want that in miles per hour, about 10 miles per hour. But the thing that they're known for is that bronze ram that's on the front. They would use that to ram ships and sink them, or try to also damage their oars. Is another thing that they would do. That's actually the shirt I'm wearing. I think you can see that or not. But that's the ship Olympias. That little T-shirt I've been wearing, of course, a trireme. Yeah, that would end up, being considered really the turning point of the whole war, is because of the trireme. Here's kind of a map too, where the actual battle took place. Right there, and the Greek Navy had about 370 something ships. Kind of varies how many they had. Somewhere like 370, 380 was about how many triremes they had. Then the Persian Navy had 1,200 ships. The Battle of Salamis, which took place, by the way, in September of 480 BC. Got that image right there. And then you can see also this image kind of shows you the Greek Navy, where they're at, versus the Persian Navy. And part of why the Persians lost the Battle of Salamis was because the Greek Navy, their warships were superior. With the trireme and, of course, the rams that are on the front. They would use that to sink a lot of their ships. And then they also think that the narrow pass, like that Strait of Salamis, Xerxes' navy couldn't get all their forces in. They had 1,200 ships, but they couldn't get all their ships in. And so the Greeks end up sinking or capturing something like 200 to 300 Persian ships, according to Herodotus. And I think they end up losing something like only 40, to kind of give you an idea. So Salamis is very important. It eventually forces Xerxes to evacuate his forces because his navy was badly damaged in the battle. He does have this Persian general named Mardonius that he leaves behind to try to maybe march into the Peloponnese. But what happens is the Greeks, like in the Peloponnese, like Sparta, Athens, Corinth, all band together and they bring up forces. They annihilate what's left of Mardonius's Persian force at the Battle of Plataea, which is later in 479 BC. But that's pretty much the end of the main Greco-Persian wars that are fought in the mainland of Greece at that time. They do keep fighting. If you study about the Persian Wars, they keep going down to about 450 BC. That's when they fight. And then later, I'll get to it, when we get to Alexander the Great, they continue the wars. Alexander's going to invade Persia and defeat it by 330 BC. And that's something we'll probably talk about next week. So yeah, here's kind of a map you can see here. But yeah, I think Persians were going to try to maybe march where the Isthmus of Corinth is and down into the Peloponnese. But their force was annihilated at the Battle of Plataea, which is kind of west of Thebes. And then from there, pretty much Xerxes gives up on any hope of conquering the mainland. But Xerxes still has control, like, of the Aegean. Like, he takes a bunch of the islands in the Aegean. He's still got control of Western Turkey and part of Thrace. And so that's why the Greeks are going to continue the war to try to push them out. I want to get to a last phase today, too, and talk about the aftermath also of the Greco-Persian Wars, which follow. And they do have a period that comes next, which is called the Golden Age of Athens. which it's got different names. They called it. Some people call it the gold. They call it the Age of Pericles. Also, the Golden Age of Greece. I think is kind of another name. They nickname it, but it's kind of a peak period of the Greek city-state, but especially with Athens at the helm, because Athens kind of forms this empire throughout the region, which is called the Athenian Empire. And a little bit about this empire. If we go to this slide right here, you can see that what happened was Athens began to rebuild itself after the war. They used it with an alliance that is called the Delian League. What was the Delian League? I'll kind of put it on the screen here for you, but the Delian League was this confederation of Greek city-states that were throughout the Aegean. Parts of like Greek mainland, islands in the Aegean, Western Turkey, part of Thrace. And it formed in 478 BC. And part of why it formed initially was to form an alliance to fight Persia, because I guess they feared that Persia would invade again. And then they also wanted to push the Persians out of the Aegean basin, was the other reason for it. And in fact, they fought a series of wars afterwards. They call it sometimes the Wars of the Delian League, which Pericles was involved in. And 477 to 449 was the remaining part of the wars. And they mostly were successful in pushing them out of the Aegean. Why do they call it Delian? It's named after the island of Delos, which is in the Aegean, in the Cyclades. There was a temple of Apollo there where they would meet. It's also where they kept the money for the treasury. And so that's where the actual name came from, Delian League or Delos. But what ends up happening, if you know about it, is that the Athenians, who are the main city-state in it, they take all the money from the treasury and they move it to Athens. This happens under Pericles. And so the Athenians then use this league to expand it into an empire. But it was kind of like a trading empire that the Athenians were kind of involved in with Attica, et cetera. And so that's something they kind of dominate for a while. Here's kind of course, Acropolis of Athens. Of course, we'll talk about Pericles a little bit. Pericles is a famous politician I've talked about before. He was born in 494 BC, and eventually he would kind of take control of the city as one of its main leaders politically in 461, which he'll control Athens for something like around 30 years overall. Pericles is famous for a lot of things I've talked about before. Pericles was the one that rebuilt the Acropolis that you're looking at in that image, where he took a lot of the money from the state, like the Delian League even. They spent it lavishly on building these public buildings, like the Parthenon, I told you about some of the other temples they built. The Recthean temple was also erected as well. Temple of Temple of Athena Nike, of course, was also constructed as well around that same time overall. And then he also took the money too, and he spent a lot on their navy, like expanding the Greek navies and things like that to fight against, Persia, etc. So Pericles was a man of the people. He spent money also to, expand like Greek arts, culture, architecture, playwrights, artists, sculptors, things like that. And kind of show images right here. Of course, we've talked about before the building, of like the Parthenon, the most famous thing that was constructed, under Pericles, which Pericles, I think, completed the construction of the Parthenon close to about 430 BC, like right before I think he died. And one thing that's very famous under Pericles, there was a man named Phidias, you may have heard of. Phidias was the one that constructed a lot of the buildings on the actual Acropolis. Who was Phidias? Phidias was this famous Greek sculptor and architect, considered one of the greatest in the Greek world. And he's the one that pretty much constructed the Parthenon, especially all the statues and the friezes that went on it. He's also the famous architect and sculptor that built the Temple of Zeus in Olympia, which had a huge statue of Zeus he constructed that was part of it. I think one of the seven wonders of the world at one point. And so, like images you'll see sometimes, paintings or whatever, showing you what the Acropolis looked like with the Parthenon a long time ago. Those are some of the friezes that were kind of put on it with statues. And some of those are controversial. They do have some called the Elgin marbles you may have heard about, which are these Greek sculptures from the Parthenon and I think also from the Acropolis that were taken by the British in the early 1800s by this man named Thomas Bruce, who was known as the Earl of Elgin. And suppose they took it back to Britain because they feared that the Ottoman Empire would do something to it, like harm it. And so they took like half of them to Britain, where they're now in the British Museum in London, and the other half are in Greece today still. And I think the Greeks, want it back. If you know about all these sculptures that they have that are in Britain. So it is a controversial topic, in modern history today. So it's kind of a debate about whether they should give those back, the Elgin marbles. But yeah, it just shows you the classical Greek culture art that's kind of known for that time period. And I think they're trying to rebuild, like I said, the Parthenon behind me. And so I guess I think they're trying to make replicas of it so they're going to put on the actual Acropolis that they're reconstructing. So here's kind of another image showing you some of these, of course, Elgin marbles that are famous today. Now, I did want to talk about one more thing before I go today, which is the Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War, if you study about it, is when the golden age of Athens kind of comes to an end. When Athens, there's a peak as its power and its empire. And the Peloponnesian War was this almost like a civil war that broke out between the Greek city-states, pretty much pitted Athens versus Sparta and their allies. Lasted about 27 years. It really wasn't one war. It was actually three wars. It was a series of three wars fought between the two sides. And part of why the wars broke out was because of the fact that Sparta was very jealous of Athens' growing power in the region. They thought they were going to take over all the Aegean basin, et cetera. And so they tried to stop them, in this conflict, which they did. And here's kind of a map showing you kind of the areas that were there. It pitted two sides against each other. Had like the so-called Delian League versus the Peloponnesian League. The Delian League was this alliance I told you of Greek city-states, which most of them, by the way, were Ionian that were in it. There's most of those areas that are in yellow were in the Delian League. And it included mostly these city-states or areas were in it. Attica, Euboea, which is right above Attica, that island, Thrace, the Cyclades, and parts of Western Turkey, all those different city-states were also in it as well. And then on the other side, you have the Peloponnesian League as well, pro-Dorian states. Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, Olympia, Pylos were examples of city-states that backed Sparta in the war. And also the Kingdom of Macedonia, northern Greece, we'll talk about next week, also backed the Peloponnesian League, and so did Persia as well. The Persian Empire did to the east, and they think that had a lot to do with why the Peloponnesian League would eventually win because of Persian aid. By the way, it is a famous war that's told by this a Greek writer named Thucydides. You see right there in that image. Thucydides wrote what they call the history of the Peloponnesian War, which they think was written close to about maybe right before 400 BC. And Thucydides was actually a Greek general that fought in the war. He's kind of an eyewitness to the war itself. And they do think he's kind of like this father of scientific history. He is one of the first historians that really uses sources right and doesn't exaggerate, maybe like Herodotus did. Yeah, I think he even criticized Herodotus, believe it or not, Thucydides. And he made a famous quote about the war. He said that what made the war inevitable was the growth of Athenian power and the fear which this caused in Sparta. That's his famous quote about the war. Yeah, in the end, the Athenian power would be weakened, of course, by the Spartan rise in power. And if you go back to that map right here, kind of what happened, they both sides had different ideas about how they wanted to fight the war strategy wise. Athens tried to rely on its naval power, is what they did. And so they could use that to strike anywhere against various allies that were against them. And then, of course, Sparta, what they did was they marched up from the Peloponnese, tried to lay siege to Attica. And so Attica got so desperate, they even built fortifications to try to block the Spartan forces, the so called long walls, I think they're sometimes called. And what really broke the Athenians was their naval power. They had this incident in 415 to 413 BC where they tried to attack Syracuse, which was an ally of Sparta in Sicily, and most of their navy was wiped out. And so from there, Sparta was able to gain more power. Part of how they did that was Persia. Persia came in and kind of formed an alliance with the Spartans. The Spartans were able to actually build their own navy afterwards and dominate the Aegean. And so a combination of Spartan naval power, Spartan armies in the end would help let them lay siege to Athens. And that was pretty much the end of the war by 404 BC. Later, they do have a deal. If you go to this map down here, I'll kind of share with you. Yeah, I kind of show right here. Yeah, after the war, kind of some things that happened to kind of give you a perspective of what occurred following the Greco-Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian Wars. Yeah, there's no more dominance by Athens. So Athens is not really a major power compared to some of the city-states afterwards. Thebes and Sparta actually for a long time vied for power in the 4th century. It's one of the main things that happens. But actually, what ends up happening? Thebes eventually defeats Sparta, which they will by about 371 BC. They have this thing called the Theban-Spartan War that occurs. And the Boeotians, where Thebes is, they eventually defeat Sparta at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC. And Thebes ends up being the big power, for a while in the mid part of the 4th century. But to the north, you've got Macedonia that's coming to power. The Kingdom of Macedon, of course, under King Philip II, Alexander the Great, of course. And those powers are really going to take over Greece eventually, take control of it. And Alexander and his father Philip have this idea where they think they want to try to get all the Greeks to kind of combine together to fight against Persia. And so that's what's going to happen next. Alexander's going to invade the Persian Empire. And that's going to lead to a new period in history we'll get to later called the Hellenistic Age, where Greek culture is kind of spread to the Near East. We'll discuss, the conquests of Alexander the Great, of course, which will follow after that. The Olympics, of course, they believe started in 776 BC. That's the traditional date that they put it at when the Olympics started a long time ago. Of course, one of several, by the way, public games that the ancient Greeks were known for. They actually had 5, believe it or not, that were kind of put on in the Greek world. But the one that's the Olympic Games held at Olympia, I'll get to in a second, was the oldest one, and I guess the one that lasted the longest over many years. Yeah, I'll kind of give you a list here, but these are actually the 5 they had. at one point. They had the one that we're talking about, which is the Olympics, ancient Olympics, which were held at Olympia in the Peloponnese Peninsula. They had some other ones, though, below you see Panathenaian or Panathenaian Games were held at Athens, which honored the gods Pan and Athena, which were kind of prestigious. Pythian Games were held at the city-state of Delphi in Boeotia. That honored the famous oracle named Pythia. You heard of her. The Nemean Games were held at Argos, and you also see the Isthmian Games were held at Corinth. So they had all these other games that they put on in Greece, but the one that's the most famous, of course, overall was the one, of course, associated with Olympia, with the Olympics. I think I've got another slide showing it right here. But the Olympic Games with that one, those are the years it was held from. They believe at one point, 776 BC, and then they think 393 CE may have been one of the last years it was held before it was banned by the Romans over time. And held at Olympia, which Olympia, by the way, like I said, is up in the, it's kind of like in the northwestern part of the Peloponnese Peninsula, like the southern part of Greece is about where it is. And it was held every 4 summers, like that slide says, of course, to honor the god Zeus. It was kind of like a religious festival, like they were talking about in the video. That was the chief god. Oh, by the way, they called it Olympiad, by the way. Every 4 summers was a kind of I guess, a chronological term they would use in like a calendar. So every 4 years, they would call a Olympic truce between the different city-states. And then athletes would come there to Olympia where they would honor Zeus. He had a huge temple that was there. That was built. I think I've got an image of that too. I've added for you to look at right here. But Temple of Zeus at Olympia, you see on the right there. Athletes would actually have to go before the god Zeus, his statue that was there, and say that they had actually trained for like at least 10 months as whatever athlete they're, I guess, competing in, whatever event. And so I think I told you that the temple had been originally built by this famous architect and sculptor named Phidias, who built the huge statue that was in it of Zeus. That's where the temple was, originally, right there. So predominantly, it was mostly religious festivals that became like sporting events, and of course, lasted about 5 days. Was how long usually the Olympics lasted in ancient times. I think I've got some other images right here. That's actually the ancient site of Olympia that you're looking at. So you can see at the top, I don't know if you see that or not, that's where the main stadium was, the Stadium of Olympia, where they had some events like running and so on. There's other public buildings that are part of that, which I guess buildings were part of the agora, I guess they had at Olympia. Let's see, also got here's kind of an image showing you the actual stadium, which is kind of still there. The actual track where a lot of running competitions, I guess, would take place. You can see where the runners would start in the front right there. You can also see kind of in the back there, there's an area where judges would sit to watch the events and judge them. And I think I've got other images showing how a lot of athletes would run through this vaulted tunnel as they come out onto the playing field of the actual stadium. Think about some other images right here, kind of showing you also the stadium at Olympia that was there. I guess there must have been seating around it at one point, but it's all, of course, gone now. By the way, like a lot of the events, if you know about the Olympics, they were all done in the nude. They didn't wear any clothes. There's different theories on why they did that. I think one theory is that the Greeks kind of thought the human body was something that the gods had created, so they wanted to be able to honor the gods, by running around naked, that kind of thing. I think another theory too is that if you know about the games, they were segregated. The men had their own games, the main Olympic games. And then the women had their own games, which honored the goddess Hera, because there was a temple there for Hera as well. They're called sometimes the Heraean Games, if you know that. But they were mostly running events. I think I heard a theory that they were naked so they would know they were men and women. So I think there was a case where even some women had tried to participate in some of the men's games, and they banned that. I think a lot of cases, women weren't allowed to watch the games, especially women that were, I think, married, couldn't watch the games. And I think the ones in the Heraean Games, only single women could participate. I've got some things here kind of showing you like some of the events that they did have that were kind of famous sports that were associated with the games. Pentathlon, by the way, was one of the most famous that the Greeks created, which was this 5-sport event where you would participate. You see down there the discus throw, Greco-Roman wrestling, a foot race, which is kind of like 100 meters basically, long jump, and then the javelin competition as well. You can see an image right there at the top here, where I'll just show you right here. Yeah, long jump, they would use these weights in their hands to help propel themselves forward. And so that's the origin of where the long jump started, was actually within the actual pentathlon, five events that you would compete. And I guess whoever did the best in all 5 would win the event. If you did, by the way, win an event, usually they would give you like a crown of olive leaves, like around your head. I think sometimes you even get a statue of yourself they would put up at the actual Olympia. I think there even like you'll even see sometimes these jugs that they would have, which will have like stuff inscribed on, like I guess artwork on it, like showing like the events, and they might get that too, which might have olive oil in it, which is kind of like money. Chariot racing was real popular too, as well. Chariot racing, if you know about it, was a very popular sport within the Greco-Roman world. Like the Romans had it, like the Circus Maximus in Rome. Under the Byzantine Empire, Eastern Roman Empire, they had the Hippodrome, famous track, of course, in Constantinople, where horse racing and chariot racing took place, and most chariot racing was usually using a team of 4 horses with chariots, and they were kind of popular because they were very dangerous, thrilling. People would get killed a lot and things like that, and so I think chariot racing was probably the most popular sport, probably I want to say Mediterranean worldwide. Of course, they had traditional running, which they say running events were the first events that really started at the Olympics a long time ago. Pancration, you may have heard of, is another type of sport that the Greeks invented, which pancration was kind of a cross between boxing and wrestling, where there were kind of like limited rules, and I think in some cases you can bite each other's ears off and things like that. But pancration was one of several examples of blood sports that the Greeks had, which the other blood sports were, of course, wrestling and boxing as well. Greco-Roman wrestling, which I, of course, also talked about already, was, of course, another sport that was also famous. Which I think I told you that a lot of these sports, like boxing, wrestling, probably went back to like Minoan times originally. Discus throw, as well, of course, another famous sport in the Olympics. And then the javelin is another sport. Some of these sports, were probably derived from warfare over time, like the javelin, which I think a javelin was like usually about, I want to say 3 to 5 feet long, kind of like a short spear, which you would throw. There is one sport that's real famous that was kind of comical. They had, it was called the Hoplitodromos race, or simply just hoplite race, which a lot of hoplites would participate in. And so you'd wear your armor, your helmet and everything, I guess you wear for battle, greaves, and you would actually participate in an actual, like a run. So it's like a kind of like a 100 meters kind of race, but they're wearing armor. And so I think they added that later, maybe 6th century BC. But it's kind of one of these races which were kind of comical. Now, also, I told you how the women had their own sports, which the Temple of Hera, of course, a temple that was at Olympia, was also built there on site. And Hera, remember, was the wife of course, Zeus. And so they have games for the women to participate in as well. They call it the Heraean Games, is what it was nicknamed. And so women, like I said, had their own segregated sports, but mostly they were just running sports, not some of the other sports like the men had. Now, what happened over time, if you know about the Olympics, they were banned because of the Romans. The Romans, if you know about it, they banned it because of Christianity. Christianity was starting to spread throughout the whole empire. And Theodosius the First, or sometimes called Theodosius the Great, as well, had become the emperor of the whole. I think if you know about that time, the Roman Empire was splitting into two empires, Western and an Eastern Roman Empire. And Theodosius actually, I think for a short time, for a few years, ruled the whole thing. And so he decided to ban the Olympics because he kind of saw it as this pagan spectacle. And so the year they think it was banned, of course, was in the year 393 BC. You can see, I'll kind of show it right here with that. And that they think he did it to promote Christianity was the reason for it, because he was trying to, convert everybody to Christianity, ban all these different pagan religions. And I guess people running around naked and, worshiping still like the god, I guess he called Jupiter by that time. They kind of thought it's kind of awkward thing. And so they they banned it after that. So I guess by 394 and after, you couldn't participate in those games anymore. So like I said, the games were around for almost like 1,200 years. It's a long time, not quite. I think it's a little, maybe 1,160 something. Yeah, I think it's 1,167 maybe, how many years it is actually. But yeah, he bans the games, and so they don't really have any other games like that until modern times. When you get the famous modern Olympics that get started in 1896, and they think that part of why the Europeans developed the modern Olympics to create camaraderie among nations, because if you know about Europe, going back to not just the 19th century, but previous, centuries before that, they had fought numerous wars against each other. You can probably go back to like the 30 Years' War, 7 Years' War, and all these other wars that were breaking out, Napoleonic Wars, etc. And so it was kind of a way for nations to kind of come together, compete in sports, and might be the closest thing you can get maybe to almost like creating world peace. Through using sports and things like that. So Athens was chosen as the first Olympic Games, which are considered the first summer games that were participated, because winter games weren't added till later. And as you can see, it was held in April of 1896. 14 nations participated, which most of them were from Europe, although the United States participated in the first modern games in that year. And kind of got some images kind of showing it right here. But here you go, 14 countries participated, 43 events, and there were about 241 athletes that participated in the 1896 Athens Summer Games. That, by the way, is one of the stadiums that they built for the 1896 Olympic Games, which is called the Panathenaic Stadium. They held some events there like running, I think also cycling, and a few other events were also held there overall. And by the way, Greece, believe it or not, the Kingdom of Greece at the time, they won the most medals, which was 47. United States won the most gold medals, 11. But they had all kinds of sports that they had there, from like wrestling, they had cycling, they had swimming, uh, you name some kind of sport. I think they even had tennis or something, like tennis being played. And I thought they had like golf or something, like some of these early Olympics that they had in the summer games. I think rowing, like those rowboats and things like that. So all kinds of kind of sports were added. I guess with some of the Greek ones they already had at the time. But they'll add winter games. That's one thing, about the Olympics. I think in the 1930s, they start adding like winter games as well. They kind of alternate, the summer and the winter games every 2 years. Of course, today the Olympics now is more commercialized. It's become more professionalized, since the late 20th century. There's been a lot of controversies, of course, about the modern Olympics, like doping, and I think some of the judges, being bribed and things like that, which I think back then they did that too. Like bribing judges was something that was kind of, I think, that went on. And I know there was a case where I think it was in I want to say 60 something AD, I want to say 66 or 67 AD. There was a case where Emperor Nero entered some of the Olympic Games events, which I think the main one he did was the chariot race. And I think a bunch of other events too. And he won it because he was the emperor. Nobody wanted to just give him like second place or whatever. So anyway, that's the so-called Olympic Games. Now let me get to next. And I want to talk about as well a little bit about drama, like drama plays, which of course the Greeks were kind of known for. The Greeks were known for putting on plays, which the most famous that they had was the tragedy or the tragic play. It's the one that they preferred. They didn't like comic type plays, like people like comedy today and satires and things like that. In the modern world, but they like serious plays. The Greeks were serious people, and a lot of the plays, usually there was a case where the main character, something happened to him, like he had a downfall or something tragic happens to him. He dies or he blinds himself or something occurs. And there aren't too many dramatists from ancient times. I've kind of got them here if you list it right there, but there's only 4 that have survived from ancient times. Aeschylus, which you see there, Sophocles, which is probably the one that's the best one, Euripides, and then Aristophanes, of course, is the 4th one. So there's only 4 that have survived from ancient times. The first 3, by the way, were all dramatists that wrote tragic plays. And then Aristophanes was more of a comic type playwright, to kind of give you, comparison between those dramatists right there. Let me first talk about Aeschylus, though. Aeschylus was considered, if you know about him, he was the father of the Greek tragedy. They think he was the one that wrote the first tragic plays in the Greek world. Most of these playwrights mostly wrote in the 5th century BC or around that time. He's also, by the way, the father of the trilogy, which a trilogy, is like a 3-part play, or I guess a movie it could be now. But he was one of the first to actually do that. And his most famous series of plays he wrote was called Orestia, which was a series of plays about the house of Atreus, like the family of like Agamemnon. It talks about the period after the Trojan War. And I think its most famous play out of that trilogy is the one called Agamemnon. But it goes into the story of how Agamemnon's wife, Clytemnestra, had him killed through one of her lovers. And then later what happened was the son of Agamemnon, his name is Orestes, would eventually kill Clytemnestra and there's like a trial, associated with that. And that's kind of the story of basically about the house of Atreus that ruled Mycenae, which is, I guess, happened sometime maybe close to the 13th century. So that's who Aeschylus is, so-called father of the trilogy. That's kind of well known today. Then they got another, of course, famous dramatist, playwright Sophocles, of course, of the Greek playwrights. He wrote up to 120 plays, which I think was the most at one point, but only 7 actually survived from ancient times. It's a case where a lot of these playwrights wrote a lot of plays, but not that many survived from a long time ago. His most famous, you can see there, is the play Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus the King. It's called. You may have heard of that particular play. And it's considered, by the way, Oedipus Rex is considered to be the greatest classical play written in ancient times. It's been put on many times. There's even been reworkings of it. I want to say Voltaire, I want to say in the 18th century, did a reworking of a French version of it called Oedipe. That's famous. And it concerns the story of Oedipus, who was the king of Thebes. And if you know about the story, a lot of irony in it. He ends up killing his father and marrying his mother. So a lot of plays have a lot of irony in it. If you watch or read various plays that are out there. They also got Medea as well, which is another play by Euripides. Euripides was the last of the Greek dramatist type playwrights, and he wrote like up to 95 plays, you can see, but 18 survive. If I can tell you about all the 4 playwrights in ancient Greece, he had the most that survived. It's part of why he becomes popular later. And he's got more plays. In fact, by the Hellenistic times, Hellenistic age, he's the preferred playwright compared to Sophocles. He was probably better, But yeah, Medea is a famous play which is kind of based on that myth about Jason. You may have heard of Jason the Argonauts, which is kind of famous in Greek mythology. And Jason had married this princess named Medea. However, he wanted to divorce her and marry a younger woman. And Medea got angry and killed their children. And supposedly the play is kind of about divorce in a certain way. So yeah, Medea is a famous play. He also wrote other plays. The Bacchae, I think, is a famous play he wrote. The Trojan Women, Hippolytus, and Electra. Those are other plays that were written by Euripides, mostly around the 5th century too. Then they got Aristophanes also. He's a very famous playwright that's known for writing comic type plays. In fact, they consider Aristophanes to be what they call the father of comedy. So he's the one that first kind of created the idea of creating plays where they make fun of people, make fun of society, or culture in general. And so he's one of the first to actually do that, Aristophanes. He did have several plays that were famous, that were well known. One I think is now considered his most famous is the one you see there called Lysistrata, which Lysistrata was a type of anti-war play which took place with the backdrop of the Peloponnesian War. And there was a case where the women were tired of the men going off to fight war, I guess against Sparta. And so this woman named Lysistrata, Athenian woman, decided to start what they call a sex strike, where they would sex with their men. And so that was the plot of the whole story of, I guess, what Lysistrata was about. He had other plays too, by the way. I'll get to Greek philosophy in a second, but other plays he had too that were famous. He had another play called The Clouds that's well known. I think I've got a list of them right here if you want to look at them, if you go back. But there should be a list of plays that he had. The Clouds is a famous, I think that one's a play about kind of a satire of like intellectuals, like making fun of like Socrates and other, you know, I guess intelligent people at the time. He's also got a place called The Frogs, The Birds. I think there's another play called The Wasps that he also wrote also. So if you think about plays today in general, like the Greek play and all that, it has had an influence on like later plays. I know William Shakespeare wrote a lot of plays which were likely influenced by the Greeks, like tragic plays like Julius Caesar or something like that, or Romeo and Juliet. Were probably plays that were kind of influenced by some of the Greek plays a long time ago. I'll get to it later, but we'll talk about mythology, because a lot of these plays, they do kind of bring in mythology stories, gods and things like that into a lot of plays and drama, and so that's something they did do in ancient times. But let me move on to talk about also Greek philosophy as well. The Greeks were also known for being one of the ones that first kind of influenced Western philosophy, which would influence like the Roman thought, medieval thought, and of course also modern European Western thought as well. And they do think that the word philosophy is from Greek originally. If I could put it on the screen for you, but the word philosophy originates from the word you see below, philosophos, which means love of wisdom or love of knowledge. And so a lot of ideas in Western philosophy originate with the Greeks a long time ago. Especially, I think, Plato's type brand of philosophy, Platonic or Platonism philosophy, probably was the most influential, but there were other philosophers that also had an impact on the West as well. They do think that the first philosopher, at least in Greece, was a man named Thales of Miletus, who lived in Western Turkey between the 7th and the 6th centuries BC. He's considered to be the father of Greek philosophy, but also the father of, I think, early science in Greece. And he did stuff with math, astronomy, science. And so they think he's the one that kind of gave birth to, especially mathematics in ancient Greece at the time. Of course, if you study about, Greek philosophy, the one philosopher that's considered one of the most famous is Socrates, who lived around the 5th century BC. Kind of show that right here, the slide. And yeah, he is considered the first major Greek philosopher that you see in ancient Greece. He even opened his own philosophical school in Athens at one point. And he is this type of philosopher that other people kind of copy, like emulate, like Plato and I guess Aristotle and others that follow afterwards. And he is known for his different kinds of methods of teaching. One method he was well known for, if you know about, is the so-called dialectic method or Socratic method. And the Socratic method was a type of cooperative, argumentative dialogue where he and his students would sit around and he would ask them questions, and I guess whatever answer he would get from them, they could then stimulate some kind of critical thinking between them. And so it's something that he kind of developed, which became part of a lot of educational pedagogy, which are kind of still used today in education in different fields. You can see he was known for different sayings or maxims that he was known for. The unexamined life is not worth living. It's probably one of his most famous quotes he's very famous for. Also, the one right there, which both of those are in the Apology of Socrates, written by Plato. He was one of his best students. He has a very famous quote where he says, "One thing only I know, and that is that I know nothing." And supposedly at the time when Socrates lived in Greece, he was considered to be the most intelligent man of Greece. I think according to the Oracle of Delphi in Boeotia, but he thought he didn't know anything, or I guess he couldn't know everything, that kind of thing. But Socrates was highly influential, so much that I guess in Athens that they accused him of corrupting a lot of the young people. And so, if you know what happened to Socrates, he was put on trial for, I think, two things. One, for corrupting the youth of Athens, but I think there's another theory that he was trying to bring in other kinds of gods or false gods into Athens. And at the time when this was going on, Athens had lost the war to Sparta in the Peloponnesian War. And so Socrates was kind of like a scapegoat for, I guess, the fact that Athens was declining at the time. And so he was put on trial and found guilty. And he was, I think, given a choice. He could either take poison, hemlock, or I think he had another choice where he could just leave, like go into exile, which they would allow. But he refused to do that. So he took poison instead. That's a famous painting, by the way, done by Jacques-Louis David. He's a famous French painter. I think he did that painting, I want to say, in 1787. But there's been a lot of images, showing Socrates. It's kind of romanticized, I guess, about it. But it's supposed to be like, I guess, the last day when he, takes the poison at that point. But I think he could have escaped. I think his friends could have let him escape or something like that. But he refused and took poison, of course, instead. So Socrates is kind of a tragic figure in Greek history. You've also got Plato as well. Plato is really considered to be the best philosopher in ancient Greece and probably likely the most influential in the end. He's really the most influential in Western philosophy. In fact, they often call it a brand of philosophy called Platonic philosophy, or Platonism, I think is another name that they dub it as well. And Plato, if you know about it, was one of Socrates' best students that was under him. And he also was one of like one or two men that wrote down a lot of the main dialogues of Socrates and his students, which Socrates never wrote anything down, if you know about that. And one thing he's very famous for, this image, about 385 BC, you can see there, he founded a philosophical school at Athens, which is called the Academy. And this particular school was considered, by the way, to be one of the first major schools of higher learning, which would be kind of like a university. It would be kind of equivalent today, where they taught all kinds of subjects, whether it be, ethics, metaphysics, politics, rhetoric, science, math, the arts, military sciences. They pretty much taught everything. And so it's a very important, school, because it influenced a lot of Greco-Roman thought over time, probably even influenced Christian thought as well. And it was around till 86 BC when the Romans closed it under the dictator Solon. So anyway, yeah, he's really a very, very important philosopher. And he does have several books that he writes, of course, which I think a lot of these books that are published later from different Greek philosophers are really kind of like lecture notes from like teaching his students. Those are his two most famous works he was famous for, which were the Apology of Socrates, and then the other big one, of course, was called the Republic as well. By the way, the name Academy, like the name of that school, That's where you get a lot of the terms academics, academia, which it's really interesting about the name. It actually was derived from a person's name, a Greek hero. I think went back to, I want to say, Greek mythology, named Academos. That was the name that he chose to call his school, named it after him, basically. Oh yeah, Plato, like I said, has got different works, and they have actually, you'll sometimes see images like the School of Athens, which is a very famous painting done by Raphael da Sanzio during the Renaissance. They'll depict, I think in the middle you've got Plato and Aristotle right there, who were at one point teaching together at that school, and then all these different people that are kind of there learning, or teachers that were also there at that actual school. So sometimes they'll call it that, the School of Athens, or something like that as well. By the way, that book you're looking at there, The Republic, that particular book is probably his most famous philosophical work. It's actually a work on political science. In fact, it was one of the first probably works that was considered like what we call a political treatise, where it kind of goes into ideals of what good government should be, politics or society. And so Plato is kind of considered like a father of political science with his influence. However, kind of funny about the name, the book is called The Republic, but he didn't really favor like a republic or a democracy. Plato thought that the best actual form of government is a monarchy, an educated monarch. I think he called it sometimes a philosopher king. Yeah, the School of Athens, sometimes a nickname for the academy. I'll get to it later, but there is a rival school to it that's called the Lyceum that kind of taught similar type subjects. Now, you've also got Aristotle as well. He's also another great Greek philosopher of the time. In fact, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are kind of sometimes called the so-called Big Three because they're so important in Greek philosophy. But he's important as well. He lived between 384 to 322 BC. Actually came from northern Greece, like around where Macedonia is today. And at one point, he was a student under Plato, in fact, one of Plato's best students. And he ended up teaching there at one point at the academy. And then he had some other schools that he set up himself in the Greek world where he taught people as well. If you know about Aristotle, he was very famous for educating Alexander the Great. At one point, he went to Macedonia, which I think happened in the 340s BC. And he actually set up a school there where he taught Macedonian nobility. And so he was able to, while he was there, he educated Alexander, who was, I want to say, in between kind of like what would be now middle school, high school age, were the ages that he taught him for, I want to say, 3 or 4 years. He does have a school that he has that's a rival to what is Plato's school. It's called different names. I think the common name they'll call it sometimes is the Lyceum. It was founded about 334 BC, but actually it was a school in Athens that was actually within a temple that was called the Lyceum Temple. So sometimes they call it the Lyceum, but it had a real name. It was called the Peripatetic School, was what the Greeks called it. You can see it was around to about 86 BC, just like the other school was, the academy. It was called the Peripatetic School because Aristotle would actually walk around the temple and he would basically talk to people or try to teach people. And peripatetic, I think, means to walk around school, basically. So it's kind of like a professor going from class to class, I guess, and teaching people. And I guess he was one of the first to do that. It is an interesting school, by the way. It is one of the first to teach different subjects, especially the scientific fields. One thing about the Lyceum, it was known for influencing a lot of theories on science, like the natural sciences and so on. And so they do think a lot of the Greek medieval science that kind of occurs later in the world were influenced by a lot of ideas within this actual school. Like you may have heard of theories like the four elements, which go back to Greek times. Aristotle believed that the earth was comprised of four elements: earth, fire, water, and of course, earth, fire, water, and what's the fourth one I'm missing? I forget. I forgot what the other was. Earth, fire, water. I'll remember what it is later. But uh, uh, yeah, earth, water, air, and fire. Air. That's an air. Not air. That one. But anyway, but yeah, that and the other thing, of course, he did too. That they think that the ideas of the solar system were kind of thought up by Aristotle, or at least spread later afterwards, like the geocentric model, where the belief was that the planets revolved around the Earth, but that proved to be wrong later, because they find out later that the planets revolve around the sun. And I think other cultures believe that, like if you go to Latin America, I think the Maya and others already figured out that the planets revolve around the sun and stuff like that. But yeah, the four elements, earth, water, air, and fire, yeah, that's something that, of course, he kind of helped to kind of popularize later. Yeah, he does have different things he's known for. He was a polymath. He studied different topics. So, I mean, anything from biology, physics, zoology. He was kind of like this amateur biologist, botanist that would collect like animal and plant specimens. Back when Alexander the Great was conquering the East, he sent back a lot of specimens for Aristotle to study and things like that. Astronomy, metaphysics, logic, ethics, poetry, plays. He was considered one of the first critics, like criticize things, literary, whatever, music, rhetoric, government, politics. So Aristotle was considered really polymath that was maybe a genius for his time. Those are some works that he wrote. But the one on the bottom, like physics, metaphysics, you may have heard of, but Nicomachean Ethics, I think now is considered his most famous work that he developed. But like I said, a lot of these works were kind of like lecture notes or something like that that he, I guess, he used to teach his students. Yeah, they had other Greek philosophers. Like during the Hellenistic period, you've got like the Cynics, that kind of cynicism that was popular, like Diogenes. Diogenes, you may have heard of him as well. The Epicureans, like Epicurus, was also famous as well. And then also Stoicism is popular. That was spread by the Greek philosopher Zeno as well. So they did have other philosophers that came later that were kind of popular in the Greek world. And I know the Stoic philosophers like Zeno influenced the Greeks a lot, not the Greeks, the Romans a lot. The Romans were kind of influenced by them. Like Marcus Aurelius, if you know about that, was kind of like a Stoic philosopher, etc. Now, let me get to next and talk about the Greek gods. I'll kind of just spend a few minutes discussing mythology among the Greek gods. Yeah, the Greeks had a lot of gods, like hundreds of thousands of gods that they worshiped, that were popular. The ones that were the most popular were the so-called Olympians. Were called sometimes the so-called 12 Olympians, or Dodecatheon, I think is another term they use, which in Greek means 12 gods. And the Olympians were these race of gods that took over the earth, especially after there was a war between what were like the so-called Titans you may have heard of. The Titans were these race of huge gods that had inhabited the earth at one point. And they got in a war. It was called the War of the Titans, or Titanmachy. And eventually what happened was Zeus and a bunch of these gods of the Olympians eventually took control of the earth. So you kind of see some of the gods that are there for later. Zeus, of course, the one that's the most famous: Hera, Ares, Aphrodite, Dionysus, Demeter, Hephaestus, Athena, Hermes. I guess Persephone, Poseidon, Artemis, Hades, Apollo. Those are some that are kind of famous, that are kind of well known among the Greek gods. Of course, the Olympians, they were called this because they resided on Mount Olympus, which was up in northern Greece. And of course, which is like 9,500 feet tall. And so the term Olympian is kind of evolved from that name. Uh, I think they say the Romans later don't really believe that as much, but a lot of the Greeks thought they did reside there at one point. You can see Mount Olympus, which is at the top right in that picture. And of course, Zeus, was the one that was the most important god. That's the one they worshiped the most, was seen as the father, great chief god of the ancient Greeks, and later the Romans as well. And it's believed that the Olympians were the children of the Titans. If you know about that, they're related to the god Kronos, which was a Greek god of agriculture. And he was a son of the two gods down below, Uranus and Gaia, also called heaven and earth, which originally be the two highest of the Titan gods that were the most important. And eventually, the children of children of Kronos, fought the Titans in that War of the Titans, defeated them and banished them, of course, to the four corners of the earth. By the way, the four gods, not the four gods, but go back here to this slide, which is right here. Zeus and his brothers, of course, we also have his sisters as well. They're important because they're the ones that will kind of divide up the earth between them after the War of the Titans. And so Zeus will end up, taking over the sky. Poseidon, takes control of the oceans, the seas. And then Hades, of course, takes control of the underworld. You've also got Hera, Hestia, and Demeter. Those are all sisters of Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. They are all the children of Kronos, of course, who's also called, by the way, Saturn, sometimes by the Romans. So yeah, let me talk about Zeus first. Of course, you'll see different names for the gods. Like the Romans will often call Zeus Jupiter, and then sometimes they'll call him also Jove as well. Of course, the supreme god, of course, the Greco-Roman religions, kind of seen as the father of the gods. And he was often nicknamed the Thunder Maker. They call this because, Zeus usually brandished the weapon, which is a thunderbolt. And so Zeus was considered really to be the most powerful out of all the different gods overall. Of course, his brothers were Hades and Poseidon. They were involved, of course, in defeating Kronos and the Titans. So he's the god of the sky, god of lightning, god of thunder. I think in some cases he's also the god of justice as well. He's married, of course, in mythology to Hera. I'll get to in a second. There's the Temple of Zeus again, by the way. That's at Olympia. Of course, that was the most famous temple to Zeus, where they held the Olympics back in ancient times. But Hera, of course, was his wife. She was also his sister as well. And of course, she was known as Juno to the Romans. She's often seen as this mother goddess that's associated with things like marriage, childbirth, protector of women and the family. And so she was often honored by a lot of different cults that made her popular. Told you that also she had her own temple at Olympia, where they had the Heraean Games were held there as well. So just kind of seen as a very important goddess in the Greek Roman world. However, about it, Hera and Zeus sometimes don't get along. And of course, Zeus is known for a lot of philandering, having affairs with different immortals and mortals. So he has, that's one thing about Zeus. He has a lot of children, of course. There's the Temple of Hera again, of course, at Olympia I was talking about, probably the most famous one that was built in the Greek world at the time. Of course, you also got Poseidon. as well the brother of Zeus. He was, of course, known for brandishing a weapon too, which you see there is the trident, which is like a type of spear, looks like a pitchfork. Of course, the Romans called him Neptune. Poseidon was very important. They really consider him to be probably the second most powerful god behind Zeus, in the Greco-Roman gods and all that. God of the oceans, God of the seas. He's also known as the earth shaker because he would, cause earthquakes to occur. It's also associated with tsunamis. In ancient times, and they think that Poseidon was the one that created the horse, believe it or not. Poseidon is known for living beneath the oceans at his own palace, but he does kind of go back and forth between Mount Olympus and the ocean. But like I said, he's considered one of the most powerful gods up there with Zeus. Then you've got Hades, the brother of Zeus, and Poseidon. Hades is called different names. Sometimes they call him Pluto. He's also sometimes called Dis, believe it or not, D-I-S. But Hades is the god that got, after the War of the Titans, control of the underworld. So he quite often is called that because of that. But they sometimes think his real name is Pluto, like the planet and all that. And he was famous for being married to Persephone. You may have heard of her, who was a daughter of Zeus and Demeter. And supposedly there's a story where when Persephone would go to live with Hades in the underworld, the world would have winter. And then when she'd go to live with Demeter, they'd have springtime. So it kind of changed the seasons when she would kind of go back and forth. Yeah, he's a Greek god of wealth. He had his own weapon too, which was called the Cape of Invisibility or Cap of Invisibility. Or I think they also call it the Helm of Darkness, where you'd put it on like a helmet on your head. It's like a helmet, basically, and it would make you invisible. So I guess kind of what it's in his left hand, you can kind of see there on the right, cap or Cape of Invisibility. Hestia was another sister, Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, etc. She was known as the virgin goddess of the hearth, or what we call the fireside, where in the Greco-Roman world, they would keep this eternal flame going, which would represent the home, the family, and maybe even civilization itself. And Hestia was known as the Roman equivalent, which was Vesta. It was kind of a popular god, I know, during the Roman times. And she was a daughter of Kronos also as well. In fact, one of the firstborn of Kronos, you can see. Under the Romans, they had this priestesshood that was well known, that was called the Vestal Virgins, where they would tend this eternal flame. They had to keep their virginity the whole time that they were a priestess. By the way, they think that's where, I guess, the Olympics, they have that flame that they use, that like the torch or whatever. I think kind of represented that went back to that time. Demeter was another of one of the sisters of Zeus, Hades, Poseidon, Hera, and Hestia, and she's associated predominantly with the harvest, like the grain crops that were grown in the Greek world. They called her also the Roman equivalent, which was Ceres as well. She was also associated with fertility, you can see, and she does appear a lot in a lot of Homeric hymns and stories about her, especially her and her daughter Persephone, which I kind of mentioned about earlier. But that's basically kind of like the brothers and sisters that were kind of the children, of course, of the god Kronos that I was talking about. Let me get into the children of Zeus. They were kind of famous, which he does have a lot of children that are well known. Of course, one of the first you see there is the goddess Athena, who the Romans had equivalent, which is Minerva. Of course, we've talked about her a lot before. She's the main patron goddess of Athens, associated with things like war and peace, but also the arts. She's kind of considered like a goddess associated with knowledge and wisdom. and also believed to be the god that gave the Greeks the olive tree, which they used to make into olive oil and use as a food source. And I think in mythology, if you read about her, there's a story where she sprang from Zeus's forehead, where he had this horrible headache, and she popped out, and that's how she was supposedly born. And she is one of three virgin goddesses, of course, in the Greek Greco-Roman pantheon. I think they call her sometimes the gray-eyed virgin. A lot of times she appears as a hoplite soldier, but you see on that right that replica statue of her, and usually she's holding in her hand the goddess Nike, of course, the goddess of victory, also called Victoria by the Romans. So very popular god, of course, in the Greek world. Apollo, very popular Greek god, of course, son of Zeus as well. He's associated with a lot of different things. He doesn't really have another name. Usually the Romans called him Apollo as well. But he was associated with a lot of things, mostly the god of the sun, main thing, but also the god of light, the god of knowledge, poetry, music, prophecy, and truth. And there were various temples throughout Greece that were kind of famous for being associated with Apollo. The two most famous was on the island of Delos, supposedly where he was born, and then Delphi in Boeotia was the most famous, where they had the Oracle of Delphi, Pythia, that was there, priestess who could tell your prophecy, like your future. But if she did, it would be in a riddle, and you had to figure it out. Usually, Apollo was symbolized with a golden bow and arrow, and he would also be, playing a stringed instrument like the lyre, of course. And the Romans have an equivalent to him later that's kind of similar to him called Helios. I think they call it also as well, which is kind of like a sun god. And so it's kind of similar to Apollo, kind of seen as an equivalent. Hermes or Mercury, another son of Zeus, who, of course, was very famous in the Greek world. A lot of planets are named after a lot of these Greek gods we're talking about, like Mercury, of course, for Hermes. Hermes was often associated with different things. Commerce, because a lot of merchants would basically worship him for luck in business. But money, you can see luck also in fortune, kind of be part of that. A lot of athletes and thieves would actually worship Hermes because you got to be quick, like Hermes. Hermes was known for having wings on his helmet and wings on his feet, and he was basically Zeus's messenger god, kind of eyes and ears about what's going on in the world. In fact, the word merchant is derived from the word Mercury, they say. Artemis or Diana, another famous, of course, daughter of Zeus. She, of course, is often associated with hunting. So just known as the virgin huntress. So she's kind of considered this god that hunters, I guess, would kind of worship for good luck for hunting. So a goddess of the hunt, wilderness, a goddess associated with animals, but also kind of seen as a protector of children and also, I guess, of women's childbirth and things like that. And it's a type of god that supposedly only comes out at night. But Apollo and Artemis, if you know about, are twin brothers and sisters related to each other. Then you have Aphrodite or Venus as well, which is the Roman equivalent. Of course, Aphrodite is known as the famous goddess associated with things like beauty and love, of course, with fertility. And she was considered to be the most beautiful of the Greek goddesses, especially from statues that are kind of shown on the Greco-Roman world. Remember correctly, that was part of why they say the so-called Trojan War started because of the whole issue with Paris and Helen. Eros, also known as Cupid, the god of erotic love, which is kind of behind her, that was her son. And if you know about him, he was born from her relationship with Ares or Mars, who was her lover. And then she was actually married to Hephaestus or Vulcan. So it's kind of like a big scandal, in Greek mythology, her having, of course, a lover with Ares or Mars. There's, of course, been a lot of statues made of, Aphrodite, which I guess the most famous is the one on the right, Venus de Milo, that was found, I want to say, in the 1920s on one of the Greek islands in the Aegean. And that's considered the most famous statue. There's other ones on the left, so I think that's more of a Roman statue of Aphrodite. But a lot of statues, she's kind of depicted as being, real beautiful. Ares or Mars, of course, another famous god in Greek mythology. Of course, Ares or Mars is the god of war. Of course, everybody's heard of him, brother of Athena or Minerva. He basically was not as popular with the Greeks. Most people don't know that. They're kind of ambivalent, I think, towards Ares, but the Romans kind of revered him more. They kind of saw Mars as being more important, more dignified, and they even thought some of their early rulers like Romulus and Remus were related back to the god Mars, and so he was really appreciated more within the Roman world compared to the Greek one. But like I said, Ares or Mars was supposedly the lover of Aphrodite or Venus, and then, of course, the father of Eros and Cupid in a lot of mythology in ancient Greece. Of course, most depictions of Ares or Mars, he usually looks like a soldier, like a hoplite or a gladiator or some kind of Roman soldier. Festus or Vulcan is another famous Greek god that's well known, god of fire, metallurgy, artisans. He's considered like the so-called blacksmith of the gods. And Hephaestus or Vulcan was known for being one of those gods that made weapons for a lot of the Greek gods, weapons for like maybe Achilles and other famous Greek mythological characters like maybe Perseus or something like that. So he is kind of known for that. He was a son of Zeus and Hera. One thing about Festus, he was very famous for being lame. What I mean by that, he would kind of limp around, which I think was from a fall, where he had fallen and hurt himself. And supposedly he was very ugly, very grotesque looking. And so the ugliest god was married to the most beautiful woman, the goddesses, which was Aphrodite. Usually symbolized by an anvil and hammer with tongs, I think is what it is. And so he's kind of known for forging a lot of weapons and other kind of implements in the Greek world, but associated with also fire as well. So Vulcan is the equivalent to the Romans. And you have one more god I'll talk about too that was famous, Dionysus, also known as Bacchus. He's a very important god in a lot of Greco-Roman cults and so on. And of course, associated with things like wine and winemaking, fertility. Dionysus was big into a lot of festivals, the putting on of plays in theaters and things like that. And I know in the Greek world, especially in Attica, Athens, they did have the famous Dionysia, which was a famous festival that they would have. The Romans had kind of an equivalent, the Bacchanalia, also as well. And so Dionysus was a real popular guy. They say that's part of why a lot of religions later, like Christianity, Judaism, have wine, grape juice or whatever being used in a lot of ceremonies because of the importance of wine in a lot of the temples in ancient Greece a long time ago. That's a statue that was made back in the Renaissance by Michelangelo. I think it's called just Dionysus, is the name of the statue. It does have the god Pan behind him, which Pan was the god of the flocks. Panic, I think they call it, where it comes from the term panic. He's that goat god that kind of plays like a flute, basically. So those are some of the chief gods that are kind of well known, of course, in Greek mythology. They had hundreds and hundreds of gods that, of course, the Greeks worshipped, and of course the Romans had equivalent or gods that they kind of adopted over time. But over time, the Romans had other gods they brought in like even Persian gods like Mithras that they had. And then, if you know about it, the Romans eventually went to Christianity and banned all those gods, of course, over time. I think there's even a case where you have some people that even brought back some of the gods now. I think there's some case of some people trying to bring back paganism and things like that. But a lot of it's been stamped out over time, with the ancient Greco-Roman gods.